Missouri is the latest state to join the national redistricting fight ahead of the 2026 midterms. On Friday, Missouri's governor, Mike Kehoe, announced that he is calling a special session to redraw the state's House districts. The goal is to add a Republican seat from only two blue seats in the state. That announcement came just hours after Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed into law a controversial new voting map, which is aimed at giving Republicans 5 additional seats in Congress. In a counterpunch to Texas's action, the California legislature recently advanced a plan to set aside maps drawn by a nonpartisan commission to create 5 more Democratic-friendly seats. I'm joined now by Marina Jenkins. She is the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Marina, great to see you. So let me start by getting your reaction to Missouri's Republican governor calling a special election to redraw maps in that state in hopes of adding a Republican seat.
Yeah, it's really astonishing what's happening. You know, the fact that you have the president of the United States going around and, putting his thumb on governors across the country to ensure that his party gets to continue to hold power no matter what the American people want. It just really shows how afraid the president is of the American people and of the 2026 midterms and of, folks saying, we don't actually like the direction that this country is going in and we want something different.
Do you see that Democratic lawmakers in that state will follow Texas Democrats who, tried to block quorum, ultimately delaying the vote but not thwarting it?
We'll see what exactly happens in Missouri. I think what we've seen so far is a clear indication that Missourians of all stripes from, both sides of the aisle and everywhere in between are opposed to what's happening. It's pretty clear that these Republican governors are simply afraid to say no to Donald Trump, but that's not what the Republicans in state want, and that's not what the voters want. And so, I think it's a real risk for these folks to just simply be doing the president's bidding.
Texas Governor Abbott made the new congressional maps in the Lone Star State official yesterday with his signature. You have said that there are several groups prepared to file lawsuits to kind of block these changes. Are you confident that those challenges will hold up in court?
Yeah, absolutely. In Texas, the new complaints have already been filed against the new map, and the court held a hearing on Wednesday and then set a date for a trial against the new map that's going to start on October 1st. So that litigation is going to move incredibly quickly. There's an incredibly strong case against the new map as a racial gerrymander that intentionally discriminates against Black and brown voters in Texas. And I think the court is going to have very little patience for the games that Texas is playing.
The Missouri legislature, does have a Republican supermajority with the party controlling 2/3 of the seats in both the House and the Senate. So with this special session, you've already said you don't believe the voters want it there. But this instead, in your view, is strictly driven by the party. And in what way do you think it could potentially backfire?
Yeah, I think just like in Texas, I think we're going to see swift legal action in Missouri. The Republicans in Missouri thought about a more extreme gerrymander in 2021 and didn't move forward with it because it was not good for Republicans in Missouri. So, I think the idea that actually they're creating more competitive seats in some places could be an interesting sort of unexpected outcome here for 2026. And I think, in addition to the litigation, you're going to see a lot of popular backlash to what they're doing.
So in response to the changes now in Texas, California Democrats also taking steps to change the state's congressional maps to favor Democrats, fighting fire with fire is what, the Governor Newsom had to say about that. So how can Democrats justify these map changes when at the same time they're criticizing Texas and other states, for gerrymandering, maps to favor Republicans? Is it as simple as, if you can't beat them, join them?
I think there's an important difference between what's happening in California and what happened in Texas and what's going to happen in Missouri. And that's that the voters will get to decide. Governor Newsom has set up a process where this question will go to the voters of California. And right now, the reality is at a national level, we have the fairest congressional map in a generation, possibly ever. And when you think about what that means and the progress that we've been able to make to get to a congressional map that actually is reflective of the will of the voters across the country, now that we've achieved that, we're seeing the president of the United States in an unprecedented way going around and demanding that his party redraw their maps to cheat so that he can ensure his rubber stamp in Congress. I think that for the voters of California and voters across the country, it's entirely fair to say, hey, that's not right. And we got to do what we can to fight back to ensure ultimately at the end of the day, the American people get to decide what happens in Congress and not the Republican Party.
And that while the former President Obama is calling GOP redistricting an existential threat to democracy. Explain your concerns and fears about how this surge in gerrymandering may impact a democracy in the U.S. as we know it.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing from President Trump right now with respect to this effort to mid-decade gerrymander across the country is very similar to what he tried to do in Georgia and in Michigan after the 2020 election, which is to say, hey, you got to go fix this, going to these governors, going to these state lawmakers and saying, I want to win. And so you have to cheat. And, I think that is a pretty remarkable moment. I think we're in a really remarkable moment. And it's true that what we're seeing are real threats to the ability of our democracy to work as it should, which is to create vehicles in our electoral systems that allow the American public to have their say. And even if that say, as it was last year, is that there should be a majority of Republicans in Congress, that was the closest we've ever been from the popular vote to the result in Congress. So we are there. And now they're trying to push us backwards simply because they don't want to have to lose.
All right, Marina Jenkins, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.